If you haven't heard of PFAS, I'm going to give you some basics. If you have been reading about all the disturbing things, hopefully this talk will give you a little bit more information. So what are PFAS? PFAS is an acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's a very large class of chemicals, thousands of substances, probably tens of thousands, if not more. The one thing they have in common is they all have a carbon-fluorine backbone. The carbon and fluorine atoms are attached, and this is one of the strongest bonds known to humans. Very, very difficult to break, which is why these chemicals are all persistent. They're nicknamed forever chemicals. Many of them are bioaccumulative. All that we have tested are toxic. They're used for water and stain repellents and surfactants, and they are ubiquitous. Scientists have found them everywhere from the Arctic Circle to everywhere in the world. It's in our rainwater, it's in our drinking water, it's in our soil, it's in our food supply, and it's a huge worldwide crisis. PFAS were discovered accidentally in 1938 by Chemours scientists. It was a chemical reaction that they were working on, and how the story goes is that one of the scientists spilled some on his shoe and then realized that it made his shoe waterproof. So they realized that this was a chemical that, or a class of chemicals that would be very convenient for all sorts of products. So today they are found in carpets, in carpet cleaning products, in food packaging like fast food wrappers and also microwave popcorn bags, in furnishings, anything that's upholstered. Not all upholstery, but a lot of it has PFAS in it to prevent staining or water going through. It's in cosmetics. It's in outdoor gear like tents and sailing lines and backpacks and rain gear. It's in our clothing. It's in adhesives and sealants that people use to build their houses. It's in all those aftermarket coatings you use to waterproof things, in all of your nonstick cookware. Astonishingly and disturbingly, it's in things like car seats, and it's also in firefighting foam and firefighter gear. In 2019, we were the ones who discovered that PFAS were in the blades of artificial turf, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this later in my talk. So that's scary because it means that the state is literally spraying PFAS over us, over millions of acres every time they spray. So there are three routes of exposure for PFAS. You can ingest it in water and food. You can inhale it. If it's burned, it doesn't break down because remember that carbon-fluorine bond is so strong. Or you can dermally absorb it, which is very frightening. And one of the ways we know you can dermally absorb it is because of our firefighters. I have a number of firefighter clients. Many of them have cancer. They put PFAS in their turnout gear, in the gear that they wear to fight fires. And they have a much higher rate of cancer. In fact, in 2019, 75% of firefighter online duty deaths were due to cancer. Very, very scary. So what does PFAS do to you? Why is it a problem? There's an increased risk of diabetes. Okay, so as I was saying, increased risk of diabetes, increased cholesterol levels, increased cancer risk, particularly for kidney and testicular cancer. It interferes with your body's hormones, reduces fetal growth. It leads to preeclampsia in pregnant women, thyroid disease, childhood obesity, behavioral issues, and perhaps something that's the most frightening to me in this age of pandemics is that it reduces your immune function and makes vaccines not work as well on you. So unfortunately, when you try to tell someone what PFAS are, it's very, very difficult because there are so many different PFAS definitions. EPA has a working definition where they say you need at least 2 adjacent carbon atoms, one of which is fully fluorinated, the other at least partially fluorinated. Unfortunately, EPA uses this definition for just one of their divisions, and their other divisions use different definitions. We're actually suing EPA right now over this definition because they are unable to tell us where this definition came from. It just kind of appeared out of thin air. in 2021, and there seems to be no scientific basis for it. We think it's far too narrow. The states who are stepping in to fill the void left by EPA, the regulatory void, the states have defined PFAS as substances that contain at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. This is a much better definition. It's very, very broad and will capture all of the PFAS that are of concern. So why is the definition so important? You can't regulate what you can't define. And if you define it differently, the EPA's definition will give you about 6,500 PFAS. The state's definition will give you tens of thousands of PFAS. So if the definition is too broad, you may capture some benign chemicals, but if it's too narrow, you're going to fail to regulate the toxic chemicals. That's why we would prefer to err on the side of doing a broad definition and perhaps capturing some benign chemicals, but that way at least we know we've got all the bad ones. So part of the problem is this: the big companies that make PFAS, DuPont, Chemours, 3M, Gore, Dow, all of those companies, every time a state starts to regulate one of their PFAS, they change the formula, they just tweak it. That's why there are so many of these things. We call those regrettable substitutions. If you haven't watched the movie Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo, I strongly urge you to do so. It's a docudrama about what happened in West Virginia back in the 90s. There was a lawyer named Rob Bilott who took a case of a farmer. All of his cows were dying. And it turns out that Dow Chemicals, or DuPont had poisoned this entire town in West Virginia. Their water supply, they were all dying of cancer. Their cows were dying. And he won ultimately, but he's the one who exposed this PFAS situation. And after that happened, EPA started to ask people nicely to voluntarily stop producing the ones that they thought were dangerous. And the two most common at the time were PFOA and PFOS. So Chemours, and these other companies just tweak the formula of PFAS every time a state starts regulating one. So that's part of a problem because we just end up with more and more of these regrettable substitutions, and sometimes they're more toxic than the ones that they're replacing. So how toxic are they? Currently, states like Massachusetts regulate PFAS in parts per trillion, and it's very difficult to grasp the concept of a part per trillion. It's basically 1 penny in $10 billion, or 1 ounce in 31 million tons, 1 second in 317 centuries, or as industry likes to say, 1 droplet of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And the reason they like to use that last one is they like to say, oh, it's such a small amount, it can't possibly hurt you. But that's very untrue. And very, very small amounts of these chemicals can hurt you. So we have a ubiquitous toxic chemical. Surely EPA regulates them, right? That's what everybody would think, because EPA's core mission is to, is to protect human health and the environment. How has EPA regulated PFAS? In 2009, EPA issued a non-regulatory, in other words, non-enforceable health advisory of 400 parts per trillion for PFOA and 200 parts per trillion for PFOS, just 2 of the thousands of PFAS in drinking water. In 2012, they issued an unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, which basically, if EPA thinks that there might be chemicals out there that might be harmful, every couple of years, they ask the states to test for these chemicals. So in 2012, EPA asked all the states to test for 6 PFAS chemicals to see how widespread they were. Unfortunately, the detection limits that they used in the test were so high that it missed a lot of them. In 2016, EPA reduced its lifetime health advisory, again, just an advisory, not an enforceable standard, for PFOA and PFOS to 70 parts per trillion. So they went from 400 and 200 down to 70. And in 2019, under the Trump administration, a PFAS action plan was released, promising to regulate PFOA and PFOS in drinking water by the end of the year. Didn't happen. Here we are in 2023, still no drinking water standard. Under the Biden administration in 2021, EPA released its PFAS strategic roadmap, its commitments to PFAS from 2021 to 2024. There was virtually nothing of substance in this roadmap. In fact, you could have taken Biden's name off of it and put Trump's on it. They were pretty identical. It relied on voluntary stewardship. In other words, asking the regulated industry nicely to stop producing this stuff. And it introduced a whack-a-mole approach to regulation. What I mean by that is regulating them one at a time instead of as a big class, which would take 7,000 years if we were to regulate these things one at a time, because there are so many of them. In June of 2022, EPA issued new risk assessments saying the safe level of PFOA is 4 parts per quadrillion, and for PFOS, 20 parts per quadrillion. We cannot measure these substances this low. So what that means is EPA is saying there is virtually no safe level of PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. It is unsafe, like lead, no safe level. And yet we all have it in our water and we are all drinking it. We have been waiting decades for EPA to do something about this. They've known since the 1990s that PFAS is toxic. They promised to regulate PFOA and PFOS, again, only 2 of the thousands by the end of 2022. It's 2023. We still have not seen that regulation. They're relying far too heavily on voluntary stewardship. So today, EPA currently regulates 0 PFAS in drinking water or food. 0. Why? For those of you who want to know why EPA is so broken, I strongly recommend an Intercept series. It's all online by Sharon Lerner, L-E-R-N-E-R. If you just Google Sharon Lerner EPA, her 10-part series will come up. This is a series of stories that Sharon did with us about clients that we have in the EPA. We have 5 clients who worked in the new chemicals division at EPA, and they have exposed stunning evidence of how captured EPA is by industry, and yes, even over PFAS. So why else is EPA problematic? Confidential business information. EPA allows industry to declare that their chemical formulation or even the location of their factory is confidential business information. So nobody knows. So for example, here in Massachusetts, we don't even know where people are manufacturing PFAS because it's confidential business information. The Department of Defense is another huge problem. They're one of the biggest PFAS polluters in the country, in the world, because of their use of AFFF foam, which has PFAS in it, and because of oil and gas and all sorts of things. DOD has an awful PFAS problem. And also the new chemicals division at EPA, even under the Biden administration, is still not fixed. It's still captured by industry. What is Massachusetts doing? So the Toxic Use Reduction Act, they started to define PFAS as a class, not a huge class, a smaller class, but it's better than what the federal government is doing. Massachusetts has a 20 part per trillion drinking water standard for groundwater and drinking water for only 6 PFAS, including PFOA and PFOS. They are going to have to reduce this level because now EPA is saying there is no safe level of PFOA and PFOS. There are some bills pending in Massachusetts legislature about a ban of PFAS in some consumer products and a ban of PFAS in pesticides. This is a map that Pierre put together. We had to sue EPA for these data, but these are facilities in Massachusetts that may be handling PFAS. If you want to go to our website, which is peer.org, you can play with this map interactive. You can click on any of those dots and see what the facility is and what they make. But this is kind of horrifying. Just in Massachusetts, throughout the country, there's a minimum of 120,000 facilities that handle PFAS. But one of the things this map doesn't capture is every single municipal fire station. If you think about it, every fire station in the country has this turnout gear, which is chock full of PFAS. When they wash this gear at the fire station, because it has to be washed in special washing machines, the PFAS coming off of it is going into either the septic system or the sewer. Wastewater treatment plants cannot take PFAS out. In fact, what scientists have found is that the amount of PFAS in the influent, in other words, the water, the dirty water coming into a wastewater treatment plant, is lower than the PFAS coming out of the effluent. So the wastewater treatment plants actually create more PFAS. How? PFAS, it's really complicated chemistry, but they tend to break down a little bit and recombine, and they actually create more PFAS. So this slide is of a PFAS life cycle, and I know you probably can't see it all, but the point that I want to get across is that we cannot destroy this stuff. If you burn it in an incinerator, the PFAS gets airborne and can travel up to 150 kilometers. If you put it in a landfill, it rains or snows and comes out in the leachate. The leachate is sent to a wastewater treatment plant, and as I told you before, it creates more, and then that's discharged into the rivers. You cannot destroy this stuff, to the point where EPA actually put out a reward, $50,000 for anybody who could figure out how to destroy it. Now, there are some people who figured out how to destroy it at the bench level, which is what we call in a lab, but you can't scale it up to do it for everything that's contaminated in our world right now. So PFAS in drinking water is only part of the problem. We're drinking it, we're bathing in it, we're wearing it, we're rolling around in it. We're inhaling it, and we are eating it. It's in fish, it's in meat, it's in bakery products, it's in ketchup and mayonnaise and olive oil. It's in virtually everything. So what else does Massachusetts need to do? Massachusetts needs to ban the use of PFAS contaminated biosolids. Biosolids is basically human sludge. It's the stuff that is the solids left over when you send stuff to a wastewater treatment plant. It's human manure, basically. It contains tens of thousands of parts per trillion. But guess what these wastewater treatment plants do with these biosolids? They give it away or sell it to people to spread on their farm fields or as fertilizer. So that is one of the reasons that our food supply is contaminated, because of PFAS contaminated biosolids. Organic farms are not allowed to use biosolids. So we suspect that organic vegetables and fruits have much fewer PFAS in them than conventionally grown. Yet another reason to eat organic if you can. And I realize that's a very privileged place to come from, but Walmart, Target, Aldi's, Trader Joe's, they have some fairly reasonably priced organic foods. So if you can eat organic, you should. Massachusetts needs to ban the use of PFAS in turnout gear. We also need to require manufacturers to disclose when they have PFAS in their products. We need to sue manufacturers. We are suing. My town has a PFAS problem. We have to spend over $9 million here in Easton to build a filtration plant. We are suing the companies and part of a class action suit to get that money back. We need do not eat advisories for fish and deer because so many of them are highly contaminated. Lobster, we found in lobster between 6,000 and 15,000 parts per trillion of PFAS. I wouldn't eat lobster. So the other thing that I really would like Massachusetts to do now, and I think it's something that's low-hanging fruit, is deal with artificial turf. This is a picture of those fake plastic blades shedding, because they do shed, contrary to what industry tells us. So what is artificial turf? It's basically a plastic grass on a plastic backing with infill to hold the blades up. And we found PFAS, let me go back. We found PFAS in the carpet, in the blades itself, in the backing, also in the infill, and in the shock pad. So we found it all over. So artificial turf is bad for the environment. And for decades, environmentalists were focused on that crumb rubber infill, which is made from tires, waste tires. And industry has moved away from that because they know that people have this knee-jerk reaction of, oh, that tire stuff is bad, and it is bad. But the problem is that infill is the least of our worries, because in 2019, as I told you earlier, Pure discovered that artificial turf, the grass blades itself, contain PFAS. It's all over. And industry now finally admits that they do use PFAS to make artificial turf, and they've shifted their playbook. Instead of saying, no, we don't use that, they're now saying, okay, we use it, but it's safe, don't worry. It's not safe, and we do have to worry. PFAS leaches off of artificial turf fields into water. Dr. Graham Peasley of Notre Dame University has tested dozens of samples of artificial turf. We have yet to find one that doesn't have PFAS in it. Real world examples show that water around artificial turf quickly becomes contaminated. We've seen that in Connecticut. We've seen it in New Hampshire. And in Martha's Vineyard, one of the consultants found that 12 parts per trillion of the 6 PFAS regulated by Massachusetts will leach off a brand new field, and that will become bigger and bigger as the field ages. Artificial turf also sheds microplastics, about 480 pounds per year. And the reason that's important is because we call these little toxic time bombs. Each one of those blades of grass has PFAS in it. Artificial turf also contributes to climate change. Natural grass will absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, but artificial turf does the opposite. And there are now all these articles coming out showing that artificial turf does contribute to climate change. So Massachusetts should ban artificial turf. Towns like yours and Sharon and Wayland have issued temporary moratoriums. Other towns are just saying no, like Nantucket just said, we're not going to do that. But others are being taken to court, like Oak Bluffs in Martha's Vineyard is actually going to court trying to stop the installation of an artificial turf field on their sole source aquifer. There's a bill in the state of Connecticut right now to ban PFAS in artificial turf, to say no more artificial turf in the state, and other states hopefully will be following suit, like California. So the bottom line is this: PFAS must be regulated as a class. There are far too many to take the whack-a-mole approach and do it one at a time. As I said, it will take us 7,000 years to regulate all of them if they do it one at a time. They all share that really strong carbon-fluorine bond. They're all persistent. Most of them are bioaccumulative, many are toxic, and one by one takes too long. We have to regulate them as a class. Massachusetts needs to take a lead on this and start doing that. So I like to liken the PFAS situation to a bathtub that's overrunning. Here's a bathtub that's overflowing. The tap is on full force. EPA has a teaspoon and is bailing. Massachusetts, now that's my dog, and I apologize. Massachusetts has a tablespoon and they are bailing. We need to turn off the tap. And that was it. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I hope that was helpful. Yes, Concord does. Somebody asked in the chat, does Concord test for PFAS in drinking water? And is there a grant money for individuals to test individual well water? So the good news is that DEP has mandated that every public water supply in the state test for PFAS. They had to do it by, by the end of 2020. So Concord should have their results on your water supply website, whatever your water department website is. I don't know off the top of my head how bad Concord is, but I do know that we are all contaminated, some worse than others. Here in Easton, like I said, we have more than 20 parts per trillion, so we're under an order by DEP to filter the water now. I don't know if yours is over 20 parts per trillion for those 6, but given that EPA just said that there is no safe level of PFOA and PFOS, you cannot just ignore it and think that the 20 part per trillion that the state has is going to be protective. I strongly urge everybody to get a filter in their house at their kitchen sink. They only cost about $150. Make sure you get one that removes PFAS, and NSF has a list. If you go to your favorite search engine and put in NSF water filter PFAS, it will come up with a list of those that have been certified. I use the A.O. Smith filter that I got at Lowe's. It cost me $129 and it does a great job. For those of you who have private well water, DEP does have a grant program to test the private well water. And I don't know if they've run out of money yet, but hopefully there will be more money coming. Don't think that because you have a private well, you're safe, because you're not. Nobody is safe from this. Absolutely nobody is safe from this. Has anyone been talking to the new Healy administration about this? Maura Healy knows about PFAS. We've been trying to urge the state to join some of these class action suits. At the governor's level, she needs to be urged to let some of the, to push some of this legislation. we really, believe it or not, the state of Maine is ahead of the game here. They're the ones that are leading the country. And they have done a ban in PFAS in consumer products. It doesn't kick in totally until 2024, 2025, but still it's way ahead of what anyone else is doing. They've banned PFAS in biosolids. They're really taking strong action on this, which is surprising to me because usually Maine isn't like that. I think part of the reason they're doing it is that they have a huge problem with their farms. A lot of their farmers are going bankrupt and having to leave their farms. Their milk from their cows is totally contaminated because they've used paper sludge, and there's PFAS in a lot of paper. So when you use paper sludge on your fields, you're contaminated, and they use biosolids there too. So Maine has got a huge, huge problem. Out in New Mexico, there's one farm where the farmer had to kill all his cows, and his cows are hazardous waste. So they're just rotting in the field because nobody will take them because they're so full of PFAS. Legislation that's being filed, there are, as I said, some bans on PFAS in consumer products, and we're trying to get something on biosolids, but farmers are fighting us. I don't know why. I do know why, but it's very difficult. Farmers are on a very small, thin margin for being economically viable, and we're made by not allowing them to use these very cheap fertilizers. It's going to push a lot of them over the edge, and they're not going to be profitable. There's got to be an answer, though. We have to have an answer. Maybe instead of the federal government subsidizing beef and milk and the fossil fuel industry, we should be subsidizing organic farms. Is there an overlap between the defense industry's use and civil use? So here's the reason that the Department of Defense has been fighting the federal regulation of PFAS. Because they're the biggest polluter, they're going to be fiscally responsible for cleaning up their sites. And so they're trying to keep the level as high as possible, the legal limit as high as possible, so they don't have to clean up a lot of their sites, because it will cost them tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to clean up just the sites in the United States if the government comes out with a strong cleanup level. But there is an overlap with the AFFF foam. And that's one of the reasons why the defense industry has such a PFAS problem, is the AFFF foam is pure PFAS. And it's being phased out. In fact, there's a federal bill that will preclude the use of AFFF foam, and there are alternatives to AFFF foam. But that overlap is the AFFF foam, because some of the municipal and state firefighters also use that foam, but everybody is phasing that out. And as I said before, it's so ubiquitous. It's in so many products. I have tried to get rid of PFAS in my house. I should test my blood to see if my blood is as high as some other people. I don't have any carpets. I don't have any upholstered furniture that have PFAS in it. I don't have any nonstick pans, and have not for years. Use stainless steel or cast iron. It's in Post-it notes. It's in Sharpies. I buy my rain gear from companies that say no PFAS. IKEA, by the way, is one of the companies that have banned PFAS in all of their products. So you can safely buy upholstered furniture at IKEA and not worry about the PFAS. But you really have to do due diligence, because these companies will try to greenwash everything. And if you ask them if they use PFAS, they say, we don't use PFOA. Well, that's one of 12,000, for example. So it doesn't matter if they don't use PFOA, they shouldn't be using any of them. So finding out from the companies who uses it and who doesn't is very difficult. There is a website called PFAS Central that has a list of PFAS-free consumer products that you can use, everything from clothing to car seats to pots and pans and things like that. So you can look at that, but you really need to be educated and to do a lot of work yourself to try to avoid this stuff. It's very, very scary, particularly in this age of pandemics where, vaccines are so important.
This has to be the most mind-blowing presentation I've ever heard about something that we're faced. It's so ubiquitous and so dangerous, and yet not being controlled. Given that it's everywhere, and we can't filter this out of nature. It's ubiquitous in our bodies, in nature, everywhere. It's absolutely unquestionable that we need to immediately ban all of this. So why can't we, number one, why can't that be accomplished because of how bad this is? And secondly, specifically about TSCA, is it possible for a lawsuit under TSCA to get at this as an emergency? Because as I understand TSCA, if there's environmental or health impact, it must be banned. Any chemical must be banned if it's demonstrated to have an impact on health or the environment.
Those are great questions, Sharon. And just for those of you who don't know what TSCA is, it's the Toxic Substance Control Act, which is the federal environmental law that regulates existing and new chemicals. So part of the problem, so Sharon, just so you know, Pure is suing on some PFAS related things. One of the lawsuits that we have right now is against a company called Enhance. And you can read about it if you go to our website or if you Google it. But basically, Enhance is a company that takes plastic containers and blasts them with fluorine gas to make the containers stronger and not leach stuff out. And there are tens of millions of them annually made in this country. And they have PFAS, and the bad PFAS, they're all bad, but the really bad PFAS, PFOS, for example, at levels in the parts per billion. And remember, EPA is saying the safe level is parts per quadrillion, which we can't even measure. So orders of magnitude higher. And they're used for food. They're used for food, for cleaning products. So we are suing that company. It's very difficult to sue EPA over PFAS because it hasn't even been defined at the federal level. We are suing EPA over their definition because it, like I said, came out of nowhere and it's not protective enough. EPA can't even tell us what PFAS are and what they aren't. And they are being so heavily lobbied by industry because unfortunately, some of the new coolants for like air conditioning are actually PFAS as well. So I know it seems overwhelming and I didn't want to make it seem like it's hopeless. I liken PFAS contamination to climate change. If we stopped burning fossil fuels tomorrow, the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is going to stay around 418 parts per million for decades, if not hundreds of years, before it slowly starts to come down. The same thing with PFAS. If we ban all PFAS tomorrow, the amount of PFAS in our soil and water and food are going to stay at this level that it is now for decades, if not generations, before it starts coming down, which is why every day matters. We have to do it. But you can minimize the impact on yourself by trying to eat organic, by getting a water filter for your house, by advocating to your local boards and committees, like no artificial turf. I would love to see a town, and Concord would be a great example because you guys are progressive. You were, I think, the first ones to do a moratorium on artificial turf, and it wasn't because of PFAS, I don't think. It was maybe for some other reason. But wouldn't it be great to do like a community take back of those awful nonstick pans? Maybe talk to some cast iron company like Lodge or a stainless steel company and do some kind of take back and try to get it out of your community. There are things we can do to minimize our own personal risk and to try to push the state and the feds to actually grapple with this. I firmly believe that the state of Massachusetts will be better at this than they will help us before EPA will. EPA is coming out with that drinking water standard, a regulated drinking water standard for PFOA and PFOS. They say now it will come out by March, and word has leaked that it's going to be around 4 parts per trillion. If that's 4 parts per trillion for both of them combined, I'm happy. If it's 4 parts per trillion each, I think it's too high, but it's a lot better than what we have now, which is nothing. So we just have to keep pushing EPA. We have to vote And I know that's a very boomer thing to say, but we need to vote. And we need to push state and local officials as well.
People using a drinking filter and then throwing it in the trash.
Our filters, put them in Ziploc bags. Ziploc bags do not have PFAS, so that's good to know. We put them in Ziploc bags and bring them to our hazardous waste day, because under Massachusetts law, those filters are hazardous waste. You cannot just throw them in your garbage. So you should absolutely, we save ours, and once a year we bring them to our hazardous waste day and they're taken away.
Yes. Bernie had a question about the artificial turf fields and what we can do to keep them from being installed.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't know what your Board of Health is like, but I do know the Board of Health in Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard, is considering a permanent ban, which is not a bad idea. I mean, I am going to be this year talking to DEP about doing a ban on artificial turf statewide, like Connecticut is doing. But you guys have, I think you have a moratorium in place. You had 3 years and then it was expanded for another 3 years, right?
Kyla,
yeah.
Our artificial turf ban affects only town properties. Our high school is a regional high school, and it's a separate municipality and is therefore not governed under this moratorium.
Yeah, that's a problem. There are a number of us in the state of Massachusetts and elsewhere who have been fighting these artificial turf projects. If you need us, let me know. We've been testifying at hearings, writing letters, giving webinars on why it's so bad to put these things in. We know the playbook of the artificial turf industry. We know exactly what they're going to say, and we know how to dispute it. Basically it comes down to, the parents who think for whatever reason that athletics are, that their kid is going to be the next Tom Brady, or, their kid is going to, they use the excuse that their children are going to get fat if they can't exercise. But it's not that simple. Here in Easton, we have artificial turf fields, and we have 2 former Patriots players as our football coaches, and we don't even have a kid that gets to a Division I school. So I can promise you it's not the artificial turf that makes the athlete. And the National Football League is trying to get rid of artificial turf because there's so many non-contact injuries. I mean, they're selling you a product that it has more injuries, is dangerous for the environment, it's dangerous for the athletes, and it's impossible to get rid of and more expensive. And it's hard to believe that they pull the wool over so many people's eyes, but you just have to keep on fighting it, and I'm happy to help you. So if someone wants to reach out to me, we can talk about some ways to do that. But really it needs to be a statewide ban because these municipalities are out of control with some of these things.
Thank you, Kyla. Let me see if there's another question. So you're asking what kind of filter to use?
Brita does not remove PFAS. Berkey doesn't remove PFAS. Brita doesn't remove PFAS. I unfortunately am unable to cut and paste things in the chat. It's a problem with my computer. I don't know why. But if you go to your favorite search engine and just type in NSF, here, I'll put that in the chat. I'll type in the search in the chat, but NSF, water filter, PFOA, it will come up with a list of all the filters that have been third-party certified to remove PFAS from your water. Most of them require to be plumbed into mine is plumbed into my kitchen sink, and I have an extra faucet. So I have a faucet with filtered water that I use for my dogs. I use them to make coffee and tea and cook pasta, anything that's, that we're going to ingest. For things like hard-boiled eggs, you can use tap water because it won't go through the shell. But you need a second hole in your counter for that filter. They also have, however, the countertop ones. If you can't put a hole through your counter, if your counter's already in, or if you rent and you can't destroy the counter by putting another hole in it, you can get a countertop one. But those NSF certified filters are the only ones I trust. And the one that I got, and I'll put that in the chat as well, I got the A.O. Smith dual cartridge, and I got it at Lowe's. And it's like $129 and it works great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the question is about if you take out an artificial turf field and put in a natural turf field, you still have concerns with the water you're putting on the fields and use of pesticides and herbicides and so on. So is there some source that we can access that shows the comparisons of it to the environmental
Yes.
pollutants, I guess, for natural and artificial turf?
Yes, TURI, the Toxics Use Reduction Institute, which is associated with UMass Lowell, I think. You go to their website, and I'll put the name of that in it's TURI.
Right.
They have a great page on artificial turf, and they compare natural grass and artificial turf, water use, cost, everything. The town of Sharon, by the way, has a moratorium on artificial turf, and they are putting in an organic grass field, no pesticides, no nothing. And so somebody at the town of Sharon would probably be happy to tell you who they're using for that. But one of the things that industry will tell you is that, well, the soil's contaminated anyway, or the soil is more contaminated, so we're actually helping you by putting this plastic carpet down. That's not true, because PFAS is additive. So if you have soil that's already contaminated and then you put down plastic turf that has more PFAS, you can add it together, and that's how much PFAS you have. If you have contaminated soil, there's nothing you can do about it right now. Eventually it will break down, but adding more is not the answer. You do not have to use pesticides on the city of Springfield. If you go to YouTube and put in City of Springfield, Massachusetts, organic grass fields, they have organic grass fields that they use for their playing fields, and they're a city of 150,000, and they have no problems with that. So if a well-built grass field is cheaper, environmentally safer, and doesn't need as much water, because one of the myths is that artificial turf does not need water. It does. It needs water. It needs a lot of water. It gets so hot. It gets up to 200 degrees, and you have to water it. And if you read the small print carefully, if you don't water your artificial turf, your warranty can get voided. So, there are all sorts of myths. The industry tells you get more playing time, you don't have to water it. It's just not true. You can put in an organic grass field that works well if it's put in correctly. Your current DPW may not know how to do it right, but there are people out there who do know how to do it right, and there are towns that are starting to take advantage of that.
Okay, thank you. Another question, Charlie?
Have any towns attempted to filter PFAS at the source? In other words, through the municipality?
Yeah.
At the discharge
Yeah,
point?
that's the goal. It's just really expensive. The one town that has that I know has done it, well, two towns that I know of, Air, they were highly contaminated from Fort Devens. And the Department of Defense actually paid for their filtration system. And Braintree, I think, has their filtration system up and running. Easton's is going to be up in March or April, I think, this year. So yes, they do it at the source. That doesn't mean I'm going to give up my sink filter. I'm just going to do it for extra caution, but it will help immensely. So yes, they can, but ours is costing our town of 25,000. Our filter is costing us over $9 million. So it's not cheap, but it's doable.
If you figure out the cost of 10,000 individual filters versus, filtering it at the source, it would seem to me it would be economically wise to filter the source.
It absolutely is economically wise to filter the source, and we're doing it two ways. We're raising our water rates to pay for it, and we're also suing all of the companies who manufacture PFAS, and hopefully we'll get some of that money back. But our town did it right. Once we found out we were contaminated, which I was the one who found out we were contaminated, I tested my water and was like, oh crap. They paid for filters. They actually paid for people to get filters, and we have a a PFAS-free water station at the water department, so you can go down with a jug and fill it up. But we really shouldn't be bathing in it either. I do have a shower filter that probably removes some PFAS, but not all. But I haven't taken a bath since we found out that we have PFAS in our water. You shouldn't brush your teeth with it. We do need it at the municipal, at the source. We need it at the municipal source rather than every homeowner. But right now, until we can get that filter paid for and built, everybody needs to get one to minimize their own risk.
So we could ask for an engineering study to do a cost benefit analysis on filtering at the source. That's something a municipality could do.
Filtering at the source is the way to go. It's absolutely the gold standard. That's the way to go. Yeah, somebody's asking about whole house filters. I would be very, very cautious about whole house filters unless you're talking about a reverse osmosis. And reverse osmosis filters waste a lot of water and they're very energy intensive, but they're the only ones that will remove PFAS from the water. What scientists have found, they tested 8 different whole house filters and 4 of them actually created more PFAS than they got out, than they took out. So I don't recommend them. I'm not sure which brands are okay. I do know that reverse osmosis will work, but I don't choose that route because of how much it wastes. I just have my sink filter and waiting impatiently for my town's filter to come up.
Kyla, we seem to have no questions here in the live audience. Do you see questions online?
Somebody asked if do the filters filter out all PFAS. Here's so the filters filter out the ones that we can test for. Here's the problem. Commercial labs can only test for 70 PFAS. There are at least 12,000 PFAS. So I don't know the answer to your question. We have to work on the assumption that if we're removing 70, that we're removing most of them. Are we removing all of them? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but we can't stop using water because we die. So we just have to go with what we know. And the A.O. Smith filter that I have does a great job. Everything we've tested for has come back non-detect. So any of the NSF filters, you can also get filters on that NSF list for your refrigerator. I've gone back to making my own ice in old-fashioned ice cube trays, but they do have some refrigerator filters so that you can filter PFAS out of your refrigerator water for ice making or for if those of you who have, water in the door. It's all about minimizing risk, and we can only do what we can do. I would urge you to try to minimize your risk. They're finding there's actually going to be a 5-part series on PFAS coming out in the Philadelphia Inquirer, where this reporter has gone into incredible detail about artificial turf, because the Philadelphia Phillies are the only Major League Baseball team that's been playing on artificial turf for decades. Most baseball teams play on natural grass, but not the Phillies, and they have a really high cancer rate. So, that series is going to be coming out soon and should be interesting. I would just, if I were you, I would do everything you can to minimize your risk by eating organic, filtering your water. We even have filters on our hoses for watering our vegetable garden. Or we fill up our containers from our filtered water sink. We do our best, but so I think probably my blood serum levels are probably lower than most people's because I've been so cautious for so long, but I'm sure I still have PFAS in my blood.
Thank you, Kyla. If there are no more questions, I think we can let you go. And thank you for your time. And this has been very informative.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you, Kyla.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.